Right, I've been asked to make a video for planing, simple method for planing the underside of a fingerboard. Here I've got two fingerboards, one nice ready-made shaped one and one solid lump of ebony, much cheaper but of course much more work. Most important thing when you're planing the flat side of the fingerboard is to have your plane incredibly sharp, and it mustn't just be incredibly sharp, it's also got to be perfectly set. I also like to have a slight curve on the end of the blade here, so the blade is sticking out in the middle here but it's not sticking out at the two edges. So very gentle curve, and I always sharpen my block plane that way because there is almost never a situation where you're actually trying to make a perfect join between two edges using a block plane. If you're joining the two halves of a violin back or a cello back, you'll be using a much bigger plane. And certainly if you're in a situation where the item that you're planing is potentially wider than your plane, i.e. a cello fingerboard certainly would be, then you would want to not leave marks from the edges of the blade of the plane along the surface. So having this gentle curve here is always really good for surface planing. So certainly whenever the piece of wood is wider than the width of the blade of the plane, then you certainly want to have this gentle curve, and certainly particularly comes into its own when you're trying to plane ribs smooth when you're first making an instrument. Now if you've got a solid lump of ebony from which you intend to make your fingerboard, the most important thing to do at the beginning is to plane a surface in one direction and then plane it in the other direction and identify which is the direction that the wood likes to plane in. And then it's terribly important that once you've decided which is the better direction, that the narrow end, like on a finished fingerboard, you want the underside to plane from the narrow end to the top, to the widest end rather, and then for the other surface to plane nicely from the widest end to the narrowest end, because that's going to make life easier when you come to do the rest of the work on the fingerboard, and it will certainly make life easier for future repairers who are going to be reshooting the fingerboard. If it planes that way, then you're going to get some very angry repairers. So very important when you're using a solid block of ebony to make sure that you've worked out which direction it works in and then orientate the fingerboard around that appropriately. My method for planing something like this flat would be to put it on a bench in a bench vise and take a big plane to it and plane the entire surface in one go with something the equivalent of a shooting plane. But obviously once you've got a fingerboard that's already shaped like this, then that's going to be really difficult to know how to hang on to it. And so I find that the simplest way of hanging on to one of these, and this is where it takes a little bit of getting the hang on, I rest it in my hand here, and then I hold it against the edge of the bench here, and then I introduce the plane to the end of the fingerboard here whilst holding the fingerboard against the edge of the bench and supporting the curved side, and then I run the plane along, and as I push the plane forward I push with my right hand against the plane so that I can get some decent purchase, and I try and put a little bit more pressure when the plane is planing in the central part of the bit where it's going to be joining on, i.e. here. I just try and put a little bit more pressure there than I do at each end, so if anything it just comes very slightly hollow. And you will see that it doesn't take very many passes with the plane if it's set correctly and sharpened appropriately to get a lovely smooth surface there, which we could of course then just check to see if it's come flat or not. And I'll be honest with you and say you may not be able to tell on this video, but I can tell that it's lovely and flat. You want to check across the two diagonals, and you want to feel when you turn your straight edge or your ruler that's nearly a straight edge, but as you try and twist it you feel a little bit more grip at the end of the ruler and at this end of the fingerboard here, and not resistance in the middle. If it spins round real easy, then it must be slightly rounded, but if it grips like this one does, then we know A, that we've got a really good fingerboard, but B, we also know that we had a really sharp plane.